I'm Joseph Kiernan. I am your host campus provost here on the Metropolitan Campus at Fairleigh Dickinson University. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to yet another installment of the UN Pathways Lecture Series. Tonight we will close the UN Pathways series for the 2013-14 academic year, and we bring to a close the 14th year of inviting ambassadors and other UN officials to come and visit our campus and to share an exchange of views about a country or about a global issue with our students, our faculty, and our staff here on campus. So, without delaying things much further, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Scorza, who is the Associate Provost in charge of global learning and global activities and international education, probably a few more things that I don't know about. And Jason will get the program underway. So please enjoy the evening and keep your minds open. We'll learn something tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you, Amir, for joining us this evening on Fairleigh Dickinson University's Metropolitan Campus.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
You follow in the footsteps of some real scoundrels, and I know that you're an upstanding gentleman who will not play the diplomatic games with us, yeah? You will tell us the truth, the unvarnished truth? Excellent. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to start by talking a little bit about you, because you have had a fascinating career, 25 years at the United Nations in different capacities. Toward the end as Executive Director of Global Partnerships for the UN, and most recently setting out and creating the Global Partnership Forum. So could you tell us a little bit about the work you did at the UN, and then a little bit about what you're doing now?
Thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be here with all of you guys. Nothing works without the future, and the future is here. So I'm honored to be invited. I hope you won't regret making that mistake. Let me tell you what I did at the UN. So often we talk about, thank you. Often we talk about doing things which you're passionate about, or working on initiatives which you really want to make a difference. In my case, I was extremely lucky. I happened to be at the right place at the right time. I remember 25 years ago when I joined the UN, I had approached them a year earlier, about 15 months earlier. And it took me that much time to really get through people into the UN, talk to them, and they didn't have the traditional application process where a job would be posted on the web and you apply for it, fill up your form, etc., you get interviewed. It would be kind of through a network. And I'd met them here in New York in March of 1984. I came back a year later in 1985. Around this time, in fact, coincidentally, I met them the day before Good Friday. So tomorrow would be another anniversary in terms of my contacts with them. And at the end of the day, they called me and said, "Oh, we'd like to meet with you. Can you come in?" So Thursday morning I went in, all-day meeting, at 5 p.m., they offered me a job. So you can imagine, I didn't want to show my elation. I was thrilled. Then they said, "When can you start? Can you start in 2 weeks?" And I said, "No, I cannot. I already have a job in London. I was financial controller at that time. I had a good pay. I had a car, a credit card, American Express card." They said, "No, we need you in 2 weeks." I said, "Okay, send me an offer." So I hadn't met the human resources people. They sent the offer. The following Wednesday, it came in through something which is non-existent called cablegram, the old-style cables. And it was all complicated, diplomatic.
It was during the Cold War. They were...
Yes. And I started then in July 1985. And I was very fortunate. I did technical assistance projects. I started in the finance and management sector. I was chief of finance for UNDP. Then I went to the field as deputy resident representative. Came back, spent 5 years in peacekeeping. If you see what's happening, let's say in Syria, we were dealing with Somalia, we were dealing with elections in Cambodia, elections in South Africa, the horrific situation in Burundi and Rwanda, what happened. It's very unfortunate, but I was actually in the midst of that and the aircraft accident which took place, which resulted in the genocide in Rwanda. I subsequently was asked to chair the aircraft inquiry as well. So I was exposed to that side of it, and then one fine day in September 1997, Ted Turner arrives on the scene, and he said, he came to see Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at that time, and he says, Kofi, I'm embarrassed my government hasn't paid its dues. In January of this year, which is 97, I was worth $3 billion. I'm now worth 4, and the additional one doesn't do anything for me. So I'd like to give it to you. So we were sitting there, there's Kofi Annan, Ted Turner on this side, I was on this side. So we called him SG, fondly. So he looked at me and said, did he say 1 million? I said, no, SG. He said, 1 billion. He said, excuse me? I said, yes, sir. And he looked at me again. He said, can we take that? And I said, I'm sorry, we cannot, because our charter says that we can only accept contributions from member states of the United Nations, not individuals. Ted Turner went back. His people said he was crazy. Why are you doing that? Why are you giving it to the UN? It's a bureaucratic organization. Next morning he gets up. He said, no, I'm going to do it. He announces that evening. So we gave him special dispensation to create a foundation, and we created an office within the UN. And we gave him dispensation to call it the UN Foundation, and I created the UN Office for Partnerships at the UN. And it was an unbelievable thing. Ted Turner never asked for anything. He would simply say, I would like to give it for humanitarian causes. Jane Fonda, who was his wife that time, said, I'd like to focus it on women and health issues, which fitted perfectly within the UN's mission. I'd like to, and then Ted said, I'd like to focus on climate change, biodiversity, I said, great, protection of World Heritage Sites, we put that in as well. And as a result of Mr. Turner's arrival on the scene, we had many, many people come and say, if Ted can work with you, why can't we work with you as well? So it's a question of being at the right place at the right time. So that's my UN story.
Have you actually seen the $1 billion?
I wish I could say I was counting each one. So Ted fulfilled his commitment in its entirety. He helped raise another $500 million. To date, he has contributed more than $800 million for projects, which went through my former office, and another 450, 500 million plus. So organizations like the Gates Foundation, for example, has become a big player in this. Ford, Rockefeller, so we, for example, 10 foundations got together about 15 years ago. We asked them to help us on addressing HIV and AIDS. So a coalition led by Rockefeller Foundation came together and said, we will raise $100 billion. Because Ted Turner was around, he was also party to that, and he did the advocacy, the outreach, and so on.
Take a look at this audience. There are at least 3 billionaires here that we know of, and on the YouTube, quite possibly many more. Make the case for why a person who is a private individual, successful entrepreneur, should look to the United Nations as a place to achieve, leave a legacy, give back.
That's a very relevant question, because I would not always say to you that you must work with the UN. What I would say to you is you should think of supporting the mission of the United Nations. And when you think of it, what does that mean? You are out there to make money. What will you do with your money? What's Ted done? What's Bill Gates done? Bill Gates has reinvented himself from becoming a technology czar and a real creator of change to one of the world's greatest philanthropists we've ever seen, and probably will not see somebody like him again. So, UN looks at the challenges and problems from the prism of poverty alleviation. You look at it, hopefully, from the vision of wealth creation. They're two sides of the same coin, essentially. So when you create wealth, you're creating jobs. Poverty alleviation is about addressing the unemployment situation. Why UN? You can get branding from the UN. Ted Turner got branding. He didn't come to say, I want branding. He actually genuinely came to say, I want to give this money. And I have to say, many, many companies and foundations who come to the UN have the similar mission, saying we're doing good work, but if we align ourselves with the UN's agenda, we'll learn some more issues, we'll learn about who else is in this field, who's a successful practitioner, and then use that to give. But what we insisted was, you don't just give, you create sustainable programs. And you do it in partnership with others. That was our mantra, basically. So collaboration would create efficiencies and also give you economies of scale.
When you think about the structure of the United Nations, of course we know about the Secretary General, the Security Council, and the General Assembly, but the power of the UN rests in the member states. It's the member states that ultimately call the tunes. In your experience, how have member states reacted to the influx of interest, attention, and resources coming from the private sector? Has this been embraced? Has it been a source of concern, or both?
I would say to you both. The irony was when Ted Turner came on the scene, very, very few people asked me that question. What does Ted want? I would have to raise that issue to remind people that Ted wanted nothing. We would, to give you an example, we'd given him a badge, a UN badge. He would forget that. He would just come to the UN to, on certain days he would say, I just want to come to the UN because I feel so much aligned to the values of the United Nations. Yes, at the end of the day, there are some who will probably use the mission of the UN to say, I'm connected with that and I'm doing good, and therefore I have a great global brand. Some people might say, I want to be cleaned, if you like, what is generally termed as blue washing. We've had that conversation a number of times that we don't want anybody to use the logo of the United Nations, because that's kind of sacrosanct. There are times when an organization which has had a rough time in, let's say, in the area of human rights, treatment of workers, not addressing climate change or waste management issues, etc., they might say, we really need to rebrand ourselves and show what we're doing, the good things we're doing. So we've had those discussions and said, okay, let us bring them in. The old terminology of saying, should we keep them outside the tent or inside the tent? If you bring them into the tent, you kind of, either you embarrass them or you force them to do some positive change, if you like.
We all know that whoever pays the piper calls the tune, yeah. So in the days that the United States was not paying its dues to the United Nations, the U.S. lost influence. Is there any concern that non-state entities, whether they be corporations, whether they be foundations are buying policy influence or earning policy influence that has historically been the domain of the member states.
So I want to counter this with a question. Are you from the UN? Are you based in New York? You know all of these issues.
We've been doing this 14 years.
That is a dialogue which takes place at the UN virtually every day. Because NGOs, by the way, are regularly welcomed. But when it comes to companies or individuals, not so much foundations, but companies and individuals, the question generally gets asked, what are you doing to, if you like, buy an influence? And influence comes in different shapes and sizes. To just give you one example, a company might say, I would like to pay for renovating one part of the building, but I want my plaque there. Or I'd like to bring in an exhibition, but we would like our name prominently displayed, and so on. UN is very sensitive to that. When it comes to private sector engagement in general, I guess it's fair to say that that line is divided pretty well between the developed countries and the developing countries. Countries which don't have a good history of human rights, for example, are always concerned. Are concerned that if there are NGOs out there who might talk about the negative situation in their countries within the halls of power in the United Nations, are not welcomed by those countries. US, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, etc., warmly welcome engagement with the private sector. Silicon Valley happened despite government. You look at what's going on in India. Technology sector growing, not because the government is putting in money, but it's because of entrepreneurship and innovation taking place. Same thing in China. China encourages the private sector, even though it's a state-controlled country. It encourages private sector innovation. But where these things don't take place, then you have a challenge. And there are a number of countries you can name. You look at the growth taking place in South Africa, it's because there's an enabling environment.
There are a number of different mechanisms for non-state actors to be engaged and participate at the UN. Obviously, your office was one very important piece of that. But as far back as the 1940s, the United Nations began to recognize and award private organizations, what we now call NGOs. Honestly, I don't know if they were called NGOs in 1948. Someone should do a paper on that. Yeah. And invited them in and gave them the pretty blue passes,
right,
and pulled out the chair for them, gave them a seat, not at the high table, but a seat at the table. What do you think has transpired that vindicates that decision looking back? What can we point to as achievements of the UN or of the UN system or the UN and its partners that we wouldn't have seen in the absence of that engagement?
So, this is very, very interesting because a number of things have happened. As you rightly pointed out, when the UN came into existence, the first organization, non-government organization, which is given recognition, was the US Fund for UNICEF. I'm sure you've grown up with this Trick or Treat initiative. That was US Fund for UNICEF working on it. Then the International Red Cross came in very quickly, and a number of others. Now there are 8,000 registered NGOs, what we call ECOSOC NGOs, which is the Economic and Social Council. There is another batch of about 2,500 plus media-related NGOs, which are accredited to the Department of Public Information. So one concrete thing which is happening right now, in September 2000, when the UN adopted the Millennium Development Goals, they were put together, and I'm sorry to say that I was also part of that conversation, they were put together by a group of countries, put into a draft resolution, then discussed with some member states to say, this is what we should be doing. Here are 8 goals, 18 targets we should put in, and adopted in September 2000. These will expire at the end of next year. And a new set of goals will come into play, which will most likely be called the Sustainable Development Goals. To date, so those Sustainable Development Goals have been are in draft form, a report was prepared by chaired by 3 heads of state and government and a dozen experts from different parts of the world. That report was issued 2 years ago, and that is being discussed in what is called the Open Working Group. Open Working Group which means any NGO, any foundation, admittedly accredited to the United Nations, can come in and speak. Any individual, including yourself, you can go to the website and make a comment, make a submission, upload a paper on what you think should be done. Now, when I say, I just want to take this from a vacuum. What are Sustainable Development Goals? It's about saying, how do we address the issue of sanitation, which plagues 1.4 billion people around the world? 720 million people do not have proper toilets. About 150 million children live alongside improper sanitation, gullies, for example, around the world. Excuse me. What we ought to do is address those issues. So, and address them not just by saying, I'll make a grant to excavate that area. It's like saying, how can we address that so it doesn't happen again? How can we give access to clean water? If you go to developing countries, and some of you are from the countries, you'll know that you can't get clean water like this. We've only recently started using bottled water here. Only because it's a good fad, but otherwise you take it from the tap and drink it. In developing countries, you cannot use anything except this. If you went there, if you drank tap water, it'd be brown tap water. So we need to address those kinds of things. We need to address the issue which we're all very fortunate to have had, is education. In many countries, even access to primary education is lacking. So those Sustainable Development Goals, by the way, hopefully will be issues which will say, here's a commitment from member states of the United Nations, but it cannot be done alone. We must engage all the actors. We must engage the leadership of the private sector, the delivery mechanisms of civil society downstream, the policy leadership of the academic community. And incidentally, the academic community is playing a key role in these, in the goal-setting exercise. So.
Let's look at that question the other way. Why does global civil society, or perhaps I should say, does global civil society need the United Nations to engage in these movement goals? And these are movements, not simply policies that are written down. They actually are brought forth in thousands and hundreds of thousands of different concrete activities around the world. Why does civil society need the UN, or does it?
So, yeah, when you opened the conversation, you kind of reminded me to be candid and not be just diplomatic. So I'll try and do that. There are a number of countries who may not put aside the right amount of funding and budget for key social programs. There are 800 million people who do not have a proper meal during the day, who sleep hungry. It's not as if the food is not there. It really is an issue of putting the right policies and framework in place in those countries. That's where the voice of civil society comes in. That they say this is a basic human right. We don't even understand what's a basic human right, really, when you think of it. We don't understand that terminology. We say it, but what is a basic human right when you stay hungry? Your child stays hungry. There's malnutrition. The child is not fed properly. That's where civil society leaders come to the UN and say, it is unacceptable X country in Asia, Y country in Africa can be headed by a government which does not care for its citizens. And we know a number of instances about the lack of governance in those countries. And I'm not saying that just by having the voice of NGOs come in and drumbeat will change overnight, but it'll put people on notice at least. That's what I'm saying.
So it's almost as if the United Nations, among many other things, is a global forum for the naming and shaming of states that fail to uphold basically decent standards for their people.
I think that's a very fair assessment, because it's a kind. The Secretary General has a bully pulpit, basically. He can. How would I say, without being inelegant? He is more secretary than general, by virtue of the way the mandate of the United Nations is written. And it's absolutely understandable. Member states, at the end of the day, as you said, decide what he should be doing. Because he represents the voice of all member states. It's the concept of one man, one vote. Everybody has equal vote. So he represents those people, and therefore he can only be an advocate. His actions are determined what member states would like him to act. Hopefully I'll be, on another occasion, her actions. We hope we'll have a female Secretary General on the next term.
Let's move from the engagement of non-governmental organizations at the UN back to the engagement of what I suppose many of us would think of as the private sector, which is to say multinational corporations. I believe it was under Kofi Annan that the UN Global Compact initiative was established. The Global Compact asks companies to uphold a series of 8 or 10? 10 principles concerning human rights and fair labor practices and environmental sustainability and so forth. And then those companies are asked to submit reports to the UN on how they are doing toward achieving those goals. In your experience, how has that program evolved since its initiation?
So the Global Compact is, I would say, the largest network of private sector corporations large, medium, and some small. I think they have a criteria that a company which has employees of, let's say, less than 10 employees, they're not part of the Global Compact as such, but everybody is able to join the compact. They have over 8,000 members. It was started in July of 2000. And Kofi Annan actually announced this in January 2000 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And he said that I want companies to be part of the international development goals at the end of the day, because they also have a responsibility to society. So, looking at timeline, Ted Turner arrived in September 1997. We set up that partnership in January 1998. A number of companies, foundations, civil society organizations started coming to us. We felt that it was important to have a wider engagement of private sector. And by the way, Global Compact doesn't just have companies, it has civil society in there. It actually has, very interestingly enough, cities who are part of that, because cities say, we're also committed to positive social change. And I'm very pleased to see the way it's developed. It's a voluntary mechanism. It started with 9 principles, and a 10th on anti-corruption was added. We worked very closely with the Global Compact. I still work very closely with them. Georg Kell, who's the founder and executive director of the Global Compact, is really a leading international civil servant, is a close friend. We do initiatives together, but their mission is to engage thought leaders, business community, for them to commit to taking action as well. And they report on the actions once a year.
And those actions can be large or small, but always concrete, which seems to me what's often missing in grand schemes is that it's hard to connect the dots between the grand scheme and the actual accomplishments.
So, for example, when we were doing these partnerships through the Ted Turner mechanism, we were focused on concrete projects, either vaccination issues or health or education or climate change, but doing something concrete in a particular country, in a village, in a location, and saying, how do we address biodiversity or protection of marine life? Global Compact initially started by, or the first point of entry is a commitment by the CEO, along with a resolution almost by the board of directors, that they commit to the principles of the Global Compact. A year later, then they report on it. What have they done concretely to respond to their commitment for abiding by those principles? And Georg was saying the other day that they painfully had to ask some of the member companies to leave because of non-compliance, which I think is an excellent way to go. But, at the end of the day, there are different models of these networks. Either you do it on a voluntary basis, or you do it by law. Law becomes too cumbersome. It becomes a bureaucracy. This is a loose network which inspires change.
What would you have to do to get kicked out of the Global Compact, or not do?
Several things. First is if you don't report on whatever actions you do.
It's like not filing your
That's
taxes.
right. Yeah, thank you, yes.
Yeah. That was yesterday,
Yes.
people.
So today is penalty day. Second would be, let's say, if you were involved in anti-corruption, corruption activities. For example, your company, and it is really the corporation which is a member. So if the corporation is accused of corruption, that is grounds for them to be removed.
Would someone have to challenge their membership? Or would that be reviewed as a matter of course?
The challenge they are entitled to reapply, for example, but after a period of time, and that too, when they reapply, they have to demonstrate the change they've made for them to be, if you like, become part of the Global Compact, or their entitlement to be a good company, if you like.
Good company. As you know, I'm sure universities are increasingly active at the United Nations. There was a time that probably UNESCO would be where you would most likely see representatives from universities who would be hosting different research projects. Today, though, we have our own little blue passes, and we sneak around making trouble. There are several dozen universities that are accredited through United Nations Department of Public Information, including Fairleigh Dickinson. And there are 2 universities that are now recognized by ECOSOC, Fairleigh Dickinson and our very long-standing partners, Kyung-hee University in Korea. You may not know that the founder of Fairleigh Dickinson was very close friends with the early president of Kyung-hee University.
Oh.
So I think it's no coincidence
Right.
that we were the first 2. We experience some interesting challenges as universities because the rest of the NGOs don't want us playing in their sandbox. And I think that what we're experiencing is something similar to what NGOs writ large have experienced trying to play in the sandbox of member states at the UN. Is it your view, and you won't hurt my feelings if you say no, is it your view that a university, which is at the end of the day a teaching and learning institution dedicated to education and research, preservation of knowledge and creation of new knowledge, is it your view that a university truly fits the definition of a non-governmental organization? Unvarnished truth.
So the academic institutions are actually given a discrete classification within the UN system. UN, like all bureaucracies, puts classification into it, classification codes into it. And the academic criteria comes up differently to NGO criteria. It doesn't have a criteria for private sector so clearly defined, for example. But the UN first point of contact outside of member states is the centers of excellence, centers of training. So you are actually in a very fortunate, unique situation where you are a member of ECOSOC and a member of Academic Impact.
We'll get to that.
We're good. Yes.
We'll get to that.
So within the ECOSOC arena, we have to realize that universities, for example, are highly organized, clear thinking in terms of their mission, the agenda, what they expect to achieve. NGOs are the reverse. NGOs have only their mission of saying, I need to address sanitation in my village, or I'm only interested in delivering food aid to the camps, and so on. So each is single agenda driven. And they really don't want competition because they're out there to get funding. Private sector is not out there. So their mission, their agenda, their expectations are totally different. NGOs come, and if they see an academic institution saying, I can tell you that this, over the years, has proven that by you distributing food aid the way you do will not work, they don't want to hear that. They say, look, I have a steady stream of income. I have 15 people I've employed here and 200 down in the field. If you change that, I'll lose my job, and they'll lose. So their mission is, I have to protect myself. So a cocoon mentality. Whereas you don't have that. Your vision is not, as an academic institution, your vision is not that at all. It's about, dare I say, doing the right thing, doing the right research and applying it.
We're certainly, prepared to let the facts guide policy.
Right.
Which does not mean we always do, but we are prepared to let facts guide policy. You mentioned just a moment ago a new program at the United Nations called the UN Academic Impact, and that was an initiative of the current SG, Ban Ki-moon, working with, of all people, Fairleigh Dickinson University, to create almost a global compact program for universities, designed for universities. And universities around the world, more than 1,000, have now joined through a website,
Application.
Actually it's academicimpact.org. You'll find that it's hosted here at the university, and you should all be very proud that we've taken this role. We're asked as universities to subscribe to a set of principles, to use higher education to promote human rights, to use higher education to promote equality of gender, to use higher education to alleviate poverty, and so on. Is this all that you think universities can be doing, or could universities be doing more?
So the excuse me, the academic impact mission is, I think, goes beyond the traditional global compact type of mission, because it requires academic institutions to commit to the values and principles of the United Nations.
The intrinsic values, which are in the Charter and in the Declaration.
Absolutely. I believe that it's actually an immensely untapped resource. As you said, 1,000 universities out there. It's a great channel for the United Nations to convey to future generations as to what the UN is trying to do. And when I say UN, member states. More importantly, it also opens up a channel for the academic institutions to convey back what they feel is not happening at the international platform. I think that door has not been opened properly. And it's not that they don't want to, they want to do that. What the UN will probably do is, once the right technology is in place, because when you talk about millions of people having that access, and the UN doesn't have a budget for it, for example, to handle it. The budget is to address the programs and projects set in place by member states of the United Nations. And I feel that this will happen fairly. I think it's probably one of the highly unknown and very positive initiatives of the United Nations under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He's actually committed to partnerships. He's committed to use of new technology. And he's really what I call the voice of the voiceless around the world.
But more secretary than general.
By definition, you see, you do not want to eclipse somebody who 250 miles south of here. That's a national agenda. If I run a country, it's my issue. You don't tell me. But when it comes to humanitarian causes, I want the UN to help me achieve that, because I want other member states to come together for collective action, because no one country can address these problems. At the same time, some of the challenging countries, if you like, some of the countries who are impacted by conflict, really need to do more And it was Kofi Annan who started what is called R2P. Really, it was about when heads of state or government over a country does not look after its own people, then the United Nations probably has the possibility of some kind of action from outside. Nevertheless, you look at what's happening in Syria. Powerful countries around the world have been talking about it. And I feel that we need to act because it's a humanitarian crisis. And it goes back from the experience of Kofi Annan from Rwanda. So it was called the right to protection, for example, the R2P concept.
Do you see a time ever that the United Nations will have truly its own military capability that is independent of what the nation state members are prepared to provide?
So, consistent with your instructions, I'll be undiplomatic and say answer is no.
No.
I don't think the UN should have its own military power. It represents the wishes of member states of the United Nations. We've talked about having a standing force. I spent 5 years in peacekeeping, and we had that discussion before. We felt very strongly that that is the purview of member states. The standing force would be for humanitarian purposes if ever something was created, and it would never be a full-time army in, quote, UN barracks. They would be made available to address humanitarian causes.
There's one, well, I'm sure there are many issues that we've not yet covered, but there's one more curious development at the United Nations that we've observed over the past few years, which is the frequent appearances of celebrities, actors, actresses, singers, for all I know, dancers. And I had an interesting conversation with someone who is at the UN in a senior position concerned with partnerships, I won't say who seemed to think that this was like the best thing ever for the UN to bring in some star power. And they said we'd much rather work with them than with the NGOs. The NGOs are always complaining. But imagine what you could do with Alec Baldwin. Imagine what you could do, I don't remember the names of the actresses. I don't watch the movies. And the person went so far as to say that these individuals, these celebrities, are for all practical purposes NGOs of one. What kind of experience have you had with this side of the UN's partnership activity?
So I've been privileged to work with a number of people in the creative community. And yes, they do have star power, immense star power. You know, if you have Alec Baldwin here, you would have been standing right here to talk to him. He does bring, all of these people. They actually are very passionate about trying to do good. But at the end of the day, as you rightly say, they are army of one. The UN uses celebrities to do advocacy and outreach, to be a voice for the underprivileged, to highlight the challenges being faced by people in Africa or in Asia. We have goodwill ambassadors, we have messengers of peace. For example, Angelina Jolie is probably one of the biggest kind of focal person who's focused on refugees.
Can you or can you not introduce me to Angelina Jolie?
I'll take you to a film, actually.
All right, close enough.
Yes. You have superstars from India who are leading the charge on HIV and AIDS, Goodwill Ambassador to UNAIDS, and so on. So there are many people who come to the UN with that issue in mind. One or two will come to remind the UN that they're not doing enough, let's say in Syria or Rwanda or whatever it might be, which is also good for the UN to be reminded, and UN as in member states to say, look, you need to do more. And they come in and out. So people get starry eyes about it, but the action, I have to say, is implemented by the NGOs at the end of the day. They're on the ground. It's their people. It's the UN staff which is on the ground doing peacekeeping or humanitarian activities or technical assistance, development work, and so on.
You don't want to parachute Alec Baldwin into, maybe you do, into Syria.
He's quite capable of surprising everybody and saying, I've had enough, I'm going to parachute in.
Fair enough. Before we turn to questions and answers from our audience, I'd like to turn to your current work and ask you about the Global Partnerships Forum, which you have both founded and are now chairing. Tell us a little bit about the work of that group.
So in September 2010, when I left the UN, I decided that I had several options. I could either continue with the UN that time or focus on some issues which I'd learned over the years from the UN through meeting wonderful people. And I actually was extremely fortunate. I had a lot of flexibility in doing what I did in terms of the partnership field. Kofi Annan would say, you have carte blanche to bring in private sector partners, civil society partners, etc. When Secretary General Ban Ki-moon came into office, he reminded me, he says, I'm delighted you're doing this. I want to tell you what happened. Korea was successful because of the private sector. Growth country, tiger countries in the olden days. He says, I'm very keen that you continue like this and bring more. So he encouraged us. And then I was also involved in the technology sector. So we decided that it's the area which I know a little bit about was partnerships, collaboration, to create this platform. Simply because there are some elements of bureaucracy which would still impede us in doing what can be done. There's lots of things which you can do.
When you say we, us?
Us.
Or us and Angelina Jolie?
Us as my chairman here.
Fine.
My real chairman.
Wow.
And
You're in trouble now.
I'm totally in trouble. Doghouse. And I felt that I'd spend about 4 days a week in partnership building, facilitation, and so on. Little did we expect that we'd be working 7 days a week. And in the last 3.5 years, it's been an even greater and more exhilarating ride, because people come to me and say, look, I do not know how to talk to the UN or what I should be doing. Can you advise us? So we help connect, help the UN understand the merits of engagement. We now help curate dialogues for governments, private sector, civil society, in ways where governments would never be involved with the UN on areas which...
You're in many ways a matchmaker.
And often you don't see the matchmaker at the wedding.
Nicely put. I'd like to turn our conversation over now to David Gaylord, who is a representative of our student government. And I'm told that he will take a firm hand with the question and answer, so we'll prevent things from getting too rowdy. Take it away, please,
All right,
David.
perfect. It does seem like a rowdy crowd tonight. First off, I'd like to just thank you for coming to FTU. It's an honor. But yeah, let's get to questions. First question.
So, well, thank you for coming here and speaking with us about your work in the United Nations and the globe. My question is, coming to about universities. I guess like even young students are frustrated with their own governments, and so governments being most of the state actors of the United Nations, it's also understandable why students may also be frustrated with the United Nations as well. And so my question is, how is your global partnership forum engaging in students, and how can students engage in the Global Partnerships Forum?
It's a very good question, actually. So the UN has started to open its doors to young people. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, for the first time ever in the history of the United Nations, appointed a special envoy on youth. This is about 2 years ago.
Who's 73? No, I'm joking.
And ironically enough, he's only 29. So you have a situation and he broke that mold of the traditional bureaucracy. Appointed, his name is Ahmed Al-Hindawi. And I have brought, over the years, to the UN, many young organizations, entrepreneurship type organizations. For example, there's Nexus, Nexus Global Youth Summit, for example, of young entrepreneurs who come to the UN to do events. Conversation is not just amongst themselves. I say to them, you must have several UN speakers involved, so you interact with them. One simple way to have greater engagement, I think already Fairleigh Dickinson is doing a great job in inviting speakers. Maybe it's a way of saying, what can we do in the belly of the United Nations? Ask the UN to give space for a conversation on whatever the issue might be, topical issue. And I say that it's very easy to find the topical issues because if you follow some of the news items, you'll see. 2 years ago, I would have said to you, Syria will be finished and done with. So 2 years from now, you can talk about Syria again, actually. It'll be fine. It'll be a topical issue. I'm sorry. So, yes, you can be engaged with the UN.
Yes. Any, Chris in the back?
I just wanted to jump in on that point in particular. It was great hearing you at the conference this past week at the UN Partnerships Conference, because you really do have a way of bringing together the right people at the right time to really discuss the best issues for partnerships and action going forward. The real good news is that this summer in August, as he has donated his time in the past, Mr. Dosal will be at the Youth Assembly at the United Nations, where we'll have 1,200 people at the UN General Assembly Hall for 3 days, August 6, 7, and 8. And I believe you'll be leading, as you have before, a really interesting group of people who will discuss topical issues, and you will be engaging with some of the great youth leaders around the world. I think it's really worth it for you to be there, if you can make it, and you will really see the Global Partnership Forum in action, dealing with people who they are working with in the field. And thank you for all
I want you to know Mr. Shirata is a very good friend, and he actually does great work. You see, so Youth Assembly at the United Nations is the most creative side of the UN's engagement with young people. And then the UN tries to do things, which is another story. The model UN is another way. When you were younger, you probably participated in that. I'm still young, and therefore I still participate in that.
And those of you who are actually going to be around in August, we do send a delegation from FDU to the Youth Assembly at the United Nations. So if you're interested, you can contact the Global Learning Office, either me or Ms. Horn, who is standing in the back. Wave to the people, Sarah. There you go.
He's gonna. He'll bring the mic over. He's got a little bit of a walk.
I'd like your name, rank, and serial number.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you for coming and speaking to us. It's been wonderful hearing you. Actually, this question stems from a picture that went around before of forces, the South Sudanese forces, wearing backpacks that had been delegated for school children. And you, or rather your offices, has been in charge of such a vast amount of donations and money. And it's up to you to give them around to the many organizations and actions that the UN participates in. What are your insights on the misallocation of funds? But even when you give school backpacks, you know, they manage to sort of misallocate it. What are your insights into that?
Let's point out that Mr. DeSalle is not directly responsible for the backpacks.
obviously. Hence I
deny
said
it.
insights.
Thank you, yes. With aid, or for that matter, any activity like this, it has not been that easy to control it properly, for the simple reason that whether it's in a refugee camp or assisting displaced people, or what we call IDP, internally displaced people, generally we have to follow, the UN has to follow a protocol, a local protocol. So a village elder might say, you can go into that camp, but you have to come through us. So donations, by the way, those rice bags, they have to be deposited here, and tomorrow morning we will be distributing to everybody. Don't worry about it, it will be taken care of. Leave the 100 bags here. 20 will go into that camp, probably. The 80, or whatever, might be resold or whatever. And it becomes very difficult because you use force that's outside the remit of the United Nations. Generally, the UN, in a humanitarian operation, operates on the basis of Chapter 6 of the Charter. Chapter 7 is about interdiction. Interdiction is use of force, which we will not generally do unless it's authorized by the Security Council. We had that similar problem in Somalia, in Rwanda, where the tribal chiefs would say, only way you can come through is us. Drop the food and aid at the door, and we take care of it. We had the same thing with the Lord's Army and Liberia and so on. Nevertheless, I would say to you, at least 75% gets through. Maybe even more, but the 5% which gets picked up is a news item. Backpacks like that, I know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, it's very sad when you see it. Kofi Annan appointed a special representative to address the issue of children in armed conflict. And Mr. Olara Otunu, who was a former child soldier, was appointed the first special representative. And he's a great voice for it. He goes down and says, I want those children back. He used to go there and pull them out. But, it's difficult to address it in its entirety.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I usually talk loud enough. So you spent many years at the UN, and your new global initiative is taking root. I, too, was at the UN and witnessed that happening, and you have different factions going through a learning process, trying to figure out how they're going to govern their new role. Let's say they get that completed. Tell us about year 1, year 5, and year 10, and how it looks in your vision. Okay. Is that an appropriate question? He's smiling.
Are you? Is the question about GPF? I love it. So, thank you for we're actually going through that phase right now. So what's the Global Partnerships Forum? It's really about providing an enabling platform for people to work together and bring about positive change. And we say it's not a charity platform. It's about sustainability. It's about innovation. It's about entrepreneurship. In today's world, if you really want to address some of these issues, you can't do that in a paper and pencil way. That's finished, that's passé. You cannot just do it in the traditional technological way. You cannot even do it in the current systems which are out there for communication, because they're still one-way communication systems. If they're not, they're called blogs or whatever it might be. They're not systematically organized. What we feel is lacking and we'd like to do is to create an online platform like what I'd call a Google for development. To be able to search, if you say tomorrow I want to create an app which will automatically address the energy usage here and give me a response of how to address that. And by the way, I also want to be able to figure out, using technology, to send that energy somewhere else, where it's dark. There's no system at this point. What we want to do is figure out ways, and there are people who are thinking about some of these challenges. If you create it, if you market it really well, it'll be widely known. What we want is a platform where you can go and learn about new ideas, learn about innovation, and learn about successful partnerships. So it's a virtual platform for collaboration, what we call a portal for partnerships. We also feel that, in fact, Mr. Daly and I were talking about this early on, about the leadership role he's played in the entrepreneurship field, and we are at our infancy. Entrepreneurship, international engagement are kind of linked as well. We want to have people appreciate the merits, and as you started that question, why the UN? I think the UN platform could be useful if you want to do things globally. There are many people in the UN who would yearn to meet with you guys and say, I want to hear your ideas. You have to bear in mind, UN is a process-driven organization. It has to tick the boxes to get approval of certain things. So we want to try and move that conversation from process to action, and in a very light touch way. So the virtual platform is one, a center of excellence. We are looking to create a center of excellence for learning, for innovative collaboration, what we call. So I'm in the process of evolving the Global Partnerships Forum into an institute, a Global Partnerships Institute. I bring together academia, practitioners. We have enough policymakers, but we need people who act, and we need people who are already acting to share their ideas. So if I were to turn the question around for a second, how many of you are thinking of entrepreneurial initiatives?
Starting your own company.
Yes. Or starting a project you're doing. What kind of initiative are you working on?
You're not ready to pitch in front of possibly dozens of YouTube followers? We'll talk after about that.
So when you think of it, there are opportunities out there. I was at Princeton there 2 weeks ago to judge entrepreneurship program, for example. One was a for-profit, the other was social entrepreneurship. And there are many things going on in this field. You go to one place, you learn about it, but it's not shared. We want to create that platform. Small thing to do, sir.
It sounds like it's going to mobilize a lot of people who have interest for energy into initiatives that maybe the UN would not address itself. So it's mobilizing the masses into addressing.
We think that with the right technology, we might be able to help in a very small way people who are great at creating things, innovation, but also people who want to create, who are trying to learn to create, and give them a kind of a lessons learned platform for knowledge sharing.
Except that guy in the back. He doesn't want to share his knowledge.
Maybe he's just about to IPO.
Yeah. Fine. Cut us in for 5%. 5%?
Yes.
5% each.
The standard.
Maybe we can do one more question.
Yeah, one more question. Someone different this time. I'll in the back.
Mr. Docell, I wanted to thank you for coming also and for the great work that you do with the UN. With all the myriad problems facing the planet today, like global climate change and loss of habitat and open space and plight of the farmer, in the environmental, pollution, things like that. One of the causal problems that I see that we're facing today, but it's very seldom brought up, is population and overpopulation on the planet that people think can handle maybe 3 billion, and we're already at 7 billion. I was wondering if any of the partnerships that you deal with are actively working on a very difficult problem that most people don't even want to bring up or talk about.
First of all, thank you for your kind words. I have to tell you, I do nothing. I serve others, and I'm privileged to be in that field. I'm really honored to be able to serve. And you have to remember one thing, I work for you, sir. So, population, I'll tell you something which is very interesting. When Ted Turner came to the UN, he said, I want to address population issues. Almost the way you described. Yeah, he said, if you go to Greenland, it's the best place in the world because there are no people there. He says, we human beings pollute the planet. We take everything from the planet and not replenish it. Kofi Annan reminded us of an ancient saying, what you take from the land, you give back to the land. Increasingly, really we've seen that movement in the last 20, 30 years, that the next generation is saying, no, you don't do it that way. We'll tell you how you should do it because it's my land as much as my parents' land. I need you to do it differently. I need you to protect the planet, help us protect the planet, because it's not just for me. I'm looking at people, I'm only 18, but I'm looking at future generations already. So that thinking is very enlightening, and things are starting to change. Also, if you notice, the dynamics in the US on energy usage is starting to change very rapidly. It just so happens that we're becoming self-sufficient a little bit here. CO2 emissions in other parts of the world, they argue that, quote, you have no right to tell us to reduce energy, oil consumption, because you used it. You're an industrialized country, and now you're telling me I shouldn't industrialize myself. I won't name countries, but some countries are experiencing immense health problems because of industrialization. I feel that we are not addressing the population issue. I tell you, I've had very little direct interest from people saying, can you look at this issue? What we do is mother-to-child transmission of diseases issues, for example, prenatal, postnatal issues. Next month, we're doing a forum on health, a health impact forum, bringing together foundations and family offices. And one of the things we're presenting, which is led by the International Telecommunication Union and the World Health Organization, is a program called Mobiles for Midwives, where you present a smartphone to the midwives. They would take all of the key information, key data, put it into a centralized database, remotely maybe address some major health challenges for the mother, pregnant mothers, when the child is born, to be able to continue that direction. A number of wireless operators have said they want to support that effort. But not the, how would you put it bluntly, one family, one child policy or anything like that. We are going to have, we will reach 8 million soon, 8 billion, and 9 billion not far away, sir. And that has all happened in the last 100 years, that rapid growth.
Let me ask you one last question. It's tremendously difficult to partner with the future, because the future's done nothing for us, let's face it. The future just takes. Is there a way to creatively construct a place for the future at the table of any partnership that's seeking to address challenges of the globe?
So a number of thought leaders are starting to look at this issue. Last week, there was something called a Global Child Forum in Sweden, created by Queen Sylvia of Sweden to address child issues. We are now only addressing the negative elements faced by children at this point in time. We do not address them, aside from the educational component, we don't address those issues. So if violence against children, there's a Children's Charter, which is under the purview of UNICEF. I'm sure most of you didn't know that existed. It is there, but we don't address that. I think we do need we need different levels of engagement. We need to help the child have the right to grow up in a free and encumbered environment, the right to food, nutrition, health, etc., right to education, right to climate, and so on. But then, very rapidly, it becomes like saying, how do we help the young person, the child, when the child becomes a young person and an adolescent, an adult like you are. You're still young, you have that transition going on. How do you get engaged in international issues? Because this is not an issue of saying, it's not my problem. It is our problem. I see people from different parts of the world. You come here because you have the desire to learn and desire to go back and change your environment as well. And you can create that because you're the bridge. Actually, when you really think of it, young people are the bridge between the children and the adults at the end of the day.
Were there actual children at this children's forum?
Yeah, so there are about, I was looking at the list, there are about 5 or 6 speakers out of a total of 25. 4 of them represented children's groups, if you like, not charities, alliances. And I belong to the Broadband Commission, for example. And the Broadband Commission appointed a young person as being the voice for young people, specifically. So that person sits on the table with us and says, no, you can't do this kind of technology, or by the way, you should think of X. So he was there as well.
Our time is up. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank David, where did David go, for helping out, and Jamal as well. These events, as I'm fond of saying, do not organize themselves, and we have great staffs in the campus provost office and in the Office of Global Learning that help us put all of this together. But most of all, I would like to thank you for coming all the way from Manhattan to speak with us this evening. And please join me in thanking Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you. Thank you very much.